John, thanks a lot for being here at the Gender Matters Men Matter event.
Thank you very much for having me. This is a wonderful conference that I knew nothing about. It's been going on 4 years, I'm told.
4 years?
And y'all better have me back sometime. I enjoyed it very much.
Judging by the reaction of the audience, I think we will have to have you back. It was fun, it was entertaining, but it was impactful too. And you know, we've done this 4 years, and this is the first time we've looked specifically at men's issues. And I think, at least for folks in my generation, it is really easy to look around and see that there's so little work inside of the recovery community being done here, and we forget where we've come from here. You started your presentation with just a great summary of the, you recounted the giants on whose shoulders we are standing here today. Right. Could you give us 30 years, what's happened, and just tell us about the men's movement and how we ended up here today?
Well, the real start of the men's movement as such began with Robert Bly in the 1980s. He's an American poet, one of the greatest poets of our time, and will always be seen as such. But he started thinking about the feminine. He was sort of a follower of Jung and Joseph Campbell, so he was very much into poetry and myth. And so he started essentially single-handedly, along with James Hillman and Michael Meade. James Hillman is a Jungian analyst, Michael Meade is a streetwise storyteller who's still working today out here in California. But it was Robert's charisma and his ability to read and tell stories, and so that became the mythopoetic. It was a very complicated name for anybody outside of academia or was not an intellectual, but it finally caught on, and certainly in a big way in the mid-1980s. He was interviewed in a big film called The Gathering of Men, and that just sort of burst him on the scene. And then I started in 1986, I guess, 85, I started getting involved in what was called the men's recovery movement at the time. And then there was a lot of people involved. There was a major group called the New Warriors that started with Rich Tosi and Bill Koth and others. They became now the Mankind Project, which is probably the most functioning national and international training for men. Dr. Robert Moore was part of the mythopoetic, but I was, I was sort of a student of John Bradshaw in recovery. I was in recovery. Robert and I taught for 20 years together, and we're very close, still are. He'll be 88, I think, in December. He's off the road now, but you know, he and I sort of joined team after James Hillman and Michael Meade sort of left. He and I started teaching around a lot. And so I brought the anger and the recovery and the adult children of alcoholic and addiction portion. He brought the grief and the poetry and the storytelling. And that's kind of where we left it. And he did 30 years of a men conference in Minnesota. He and I did almost 20 years together in Alabama at a big men's conference. And now this movement has spread its tentacles out in ways like even this weekend here is a offshoot, I guess, of what was started in the 80s. Robert was the sort of the poet and pastor of grief work, and how men had to create an interior world and do their grief work. And here we are, you know. I could go on about him all day long, you know. But I'm happy to say my book came out, The Flying Boy, came out in 1986. It sold a lot of copies. And, you know, it was the story of a father-son, which is a big part of men's work, that relationship. I got a book coming out next year on the mother-son relationship, because we never really plumbed the depth of that when we were doing conferences. Long-winded, but there you go.
Thanks.
Cut about 30% of that.
One of the things I really enjoyed was so I was sitting next to Dr. John Caldwell, clearly one of the great thinkers on this subject, and taking ferocious notes during your talk, and hearing Alan Berger and bantering back and forth, and Dan Griffin asking questions. When you think of the generation of guys following in the footsteps of what you and your contemporaries started, who else comes to mind there? What's the work being done now that we should be aware of?
Well, if I had have had more time today, I would have addressed that. I was saying earlier on that aging needs to be revisited and rethought. Men's work needs to be revisited and rethought for younger men coming up. The older ones of us are dying, retiring, we sort of had our time, but there's not a lot of people trying to step into those shoes. There's nobody really that has written anything coming close to what Robert Bly did with Iron John. I mean, that was an international bestseller. Now, we have a lot of people writing on the subject, but nobody that attained some sort of stature of really being a focus. And maybe that's not necessary any longer. Maybe that was for the 80s and 90s. But I'd also would like to encourage men to come forth and step into those places of so-called leadership, and be a focus, write a book, go out and speak. This thing about the Mankind Project is the closest to that, but they're not writing any books or doing touring or any of that. So somebody's got to step up to that and take a lead.
I love it. Great call to action.
Yeah.
You gave a really great definition, well, a lot of them, but the two I'd love it if you'd recap for folks. Your definition of passivity and your definition of regression.
Okay. Passivity is the compulsion to pursue the opposite of what we say and tell everybody, including our therapist and God.
And ourselves.
What we want. It's the compulsion to pursue the opposite of what we say we want. It's the addiction to not having. People are so used to settling for so little that it becomes a habitual pattern that some people never break out of. Regression, emotional regression, I talked about that in my book, Growing Yourself Back Up. Emotional regression is this tendency to feel small or little because of some button or trigger that's in us, and we unconsciously and unintentionally return to our history. That history could be back in our 30s, our 20s, our teens, early childhood, depending on the issue and the trigger. But it's an unconscious return. So if I said to you, I want to see you in my office Monday morning, that little boy in you might be hearing, wait until Daddy comes home. And that's the feeling and the way you'll think about it. Oh, what did I do? I hope I don't get in trouble. And you're a CEO, but you still go back to your history. And that's called emotional regression. It's not a subject that is dealt with. It's a phenomenon that happens in all therapy, but it's almost never discussed. Like passivity is almost never discussed.
Yeah, we all recognize these things, but you've put words to them in definitions, which I found really, really helpful.
Well, thank you. That's my job. I can't do computers. So I could do computers, I'd make a lot more money, but I can't. I barely can use mine.
You described a relationship between smothering and abandonment. When, if I consider those two words, I just think, well, this is divergent. You describe a relationship and an intimacy between those two that I'd love you to share with us. Tell us about smothering and abandonment and that intersection.
Well, the fact that everybody pretty much in America or Western European society has been abandoned. It's impossible for a one-parent or two-parent household to not, at some time, create the sense of abandonment in a child or in a teenager. You just can't be there. Hillary Clinton wrote that book, It Takes a Village. Well, that's exactly for thousands and thousands of years how children are raised. Raised. That's an interesting Freudian slip. Raised. And so the abandonment comes. But now we're in a time where this, as I said, the helicopter parenting it's called, where parents are so scared for their children, and rightfully so, given the society that we live in and the context. But they hover over their children and do a lot for them, or won't let them do a lot because of the parents' anxiety gets so high. And so they stay sort of hovering over them, and in that way they're still being abandoned. The adult is sort of raising them with their anxiety instead of their adultness, if that makes any sense.
I just love it. Yeah, almost done.
Okay.
You spoke very clearly about the importance of finding the passion in our life as adults. You stopped short of telling us what that looks like, I think clearly because it's so individualized, and it's a fool who would try. Can you tell folks, particularly early in recovery, what that does not look like?
Well, that's a real good question. That's a very good question. Passion, well, let me just start with something I said in the lecture. If your life looks too similar to your early 20s and 30s, you're probably in a rut of passivity, okay? You're not exploring, you're not engaging, you're not actively and assertively engaging with your world and people. Now, early recovery, if you've been around that, and I'm sure you have and I have, the passion goes towards the recovery. Now, there's first stage, second stage, third stage, and what I call fourth stage recovery. The 12-step is designed to get you sober regardless of your addiction and give you support. But it is not a therapy program. Many people wish the 12 steps was a therapy program, get disenchanted with the 12 steps because it's not a therapy program, but won't go to the second stage and go into therapy, go into men's work, go into deep recovery, where you really are engaging all that exists out there to enhance your life, enhance your recovery, and enhance your development. So a lot of people will stay stuck in the passive role of going to 3 or 4 meetings a week for 30 years, 35 years, and not deal with their grief, not deal with their anger, not deal with their intimacy issues, because to a large degree the 12-step programs, which I've been a part of for 30 years and consulted at many treatment centers, and believe me, I wouldn't be talking if it wasn't for that. But that's where they sort of stay, and what life is about, a full life, is engaging, and not settling for the status quo or a half-lived life.
I love it. Okay. Last thing, you're a man who splits his time between the Appalachia and Texas.
Yep.
Vinegar-based sweet barbecue or brisket?
Well,
and you're on the record.
I know if I say one thing, I'm in trouble with one group, and I say the other. So, you know, a adult child of an alcoholic who's a chameleon and who can learn how to satisfy everybody.
When in Rome?
I would say I love it all. I love it all.
Well, John, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me.